morning all. Obviously, a few other people will dial in as we go through this. This is always the way, but let's get started anyway. So thanks for joining us to the first of the webinar series in 2021. Joint effort between ourselves at Impress and RIN, where we just take a topic and share what we can learn and share with each other. So really grateful that BHP's has put their hand up to share about one of their particular incidents that happened last year, and Eric Elston will take us through that. So this whole series is sponsored by On-Site Safety Training Compliance. They do a lot of good work across the Bowen Basin there. So really shout out to those guys and certainly check them out. So agenda, short, sharp, punchy. The whole focus of this webinar series has been what can we learn from the past and present, and then look to the future, and what can we do moving forwards. And that's the structure of the presentation today, although it will be less about what's happened in the past and it's about the present there, and that's what Eric will take us through. This is part of a larger series of webinars. You can see listed here of some of the topics that have happened previously. And there is a repository to some recordings there that can be accessed. And then moving forwards, we also have some series of webinars taking place right up until the RIN Safety Conference, which happens at the tail end of March. So I'll hand over to Eric shortly, who can take us through a lot of the content. Now we've only got a 30-minute block, so obviously if you have lots of questions, or comments, please use the chat functionality to list them as Eric goes through, and time permitting, we can look at some of those at the tail end of the presentation, and any we don't get to, we'll collate all together and hand them over to Eric, and Eric will come back to us or back to yourselves with some information around that. Okay, so I'll just now swap presentations to bring up the there for Eric. So Eric's a principal engineer at BMA, and finally put his hand up to take us through this content. So Eric, I will hand over to you now, mate, and then I'll keep pushing through the slides at your direction.
No worries. Thank you very much for that, Christian. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to show this this incident that we'd learned from very recently, actually. So yeah, as Christian had said, I'm a principal engineer. I've sort of been under the BHP umbrella, I guess, for near on 10 years across a couple of assets. So we'll talk about the response to what we see as a common issue across quite a few industries with respect to fires and fast refueling systems in general. In particular here, the incident was a pressurised system, so we'll go into a bit more detail about that a bit later on. So yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, this is just a little bit of an agenda, what we'll quickly go through within this safety share. So we'll go through the context of the inciting incident which caused the investigation, and then we'll just go through each of the actions that we identified and how we're working through them, or we have worked through them already. So yeah, next slide. So as a bit of an event overview, before we look into some much better representations of it, on the 4th of April 2020, what was happening is there was some standard refueling operations on an excavator, a Cat 336, but the fuel cap on the top of the tank had blown open under pressure, which had covered the excavator operator in diesel fuel, which had also impacted the exhaust system, and that resulted in the ignition of a fire. This was controlled using fire suppression and a couple of fire extinguishers at the time, but it's not a very pretty sight to have when when that incident happens. And you can see a little photo there of the immediate aftermath. Now, through the investigation, after a few sessions to tease out the learnings, we had come to these conclusions, which is that certain early shut-off and overfill events are quite common, not only to BMA, BHP, but from what we believe to be the wider industry as well. There's just a lack of engineering standards, which led to variations in systems and OEM components, and that can happen naturally over time when fitting what is seen to be like-for-like components, etc. Fuel systems may not be appropriately configured for the machine or delivery interface. You may have different delivery systems versus the receiving equipment, and that was something that had to be standardized as well. And just generally, there was a lack of technical understanding of fuel delivery systems by way of training, particularly for service persons or operators as well. So can we go into the next slide? Now, it was pretty clear when we were performing this investigation that, even though we had subject matter experts in the room that dealt with hydraulics, to be able to adequately convey that information in an investigation environment, through pictures, slides, what have you, technical documentation, we were finding it to be very difficult to really show what the dynamic interactions of the refueling system was. So what we'd done is we'd contracted an animation company, which we'd actually found from, I believe, the New South Wales Resources Council had used them as well in recent videos, and that's an excellent way to convey information. So we'd done the same for our situation. We've done a parts 1, which is the initial incident and lessons learned, and a part 2 overview, which is more involved with training the individual users of the systems with the technical specifics. Now, those videos have been provided to Resources Safety and Health Queensland for distribution, but what we're going to do is, Christian, if you don't mind, we might switch over to part 1 to show the video, which is going to convey the incident in much greater detail than what I've done so far. So let's roll it.
Okay, and let's hope it works, mate.
Over the past decade, there have been a number of incidents at mining operations involving refueling activities on large mobile equipment. There have been a number of incidents reported across Queensland over the last few years alone. Incorrect refueling practices can result in environmental damage from fuel spills or fire events when fuel contacts hot surfaces. An incident occurred in a Queensland open-pit mine on the 4th of April 2020 involving an excavator and service truck delivering fuel. The incident occurred as follows. An operator had requested refueling for their excavator at approximately 9 a.m. A service truck arrived near the excavator and parked a safe distance away. The operator, sighting the parked service truck, then shut down and exited the excavator. Both the operator and service person attached their isolation locks to the excavator. The service person retrieved the fuel nozzle from the service truck and connected it to the excavator tank receiver. The service person then went back to the service truck and started the fuel pump. The service person rotated the fuel nozzle handle into the on position. Through the incident investigation, it was uncovered that the common practice exists for personnel to manually retain the nozzle in the on position, either by hand or by using implements to lock the handle in place. The service person was then positioned away from the fuel nozzle while the tank filled with diesel. As the fuel level rose, it reached the float valve, which obstructed the air venting from the tank. With the tank vent closed, the pressure within the tank rose sharply. Normally, in pressurized refueling systems, pressure buildup would automatically shut off the fuel nozzle by pushing the rotating T-handle back into the off position. Not, however, while the manual override held the handle in place. The fuel continued to pump into the tank, further building pressure. The only means for air to escape was the 1.6mm bleed hole and the pressure relief valve in the tank vent. Note that this pressure relief valve cracks at approximately 16 psi and should not come into play during normal refueling operations. With the air displaced from the tank, the fuel attempted to escape from the same tank vent. However, the fuel cannot be displaced at the same rate. It is only designed for air, not fuel. The pressure within the tank increased further. The retaining tang underneath the fuel cap deformed due to the pressure, which subsequently caused a bulge in the fuel cap. The O-ring in the fuel cap had then burst, which caused the fuel to spill out on top of the tank, in addition to the fuel spilling out of the overflow hose. As the fuel spilled out of the fuel cap at the top of the tank and the overflow hose, the operator and engine bay were covered with diesel. Due to the heat within the engine bay, the diesel ignited. The service person noticed both the fire and fuel spillage and ran back to shut it off. The operator then ran to the excavator cabin to activate the fire suppression system. Then, both the excavator operator and service person retrieved fire extinguishers to put out the small fires on and surrounding the excavator. The emergency protocol was activated and personnel were notified of the incident. While several factors may have contributed to this outcome, the primary cause would be attributed to the presence of a manual override on the automatic fuel shutoff system. This is believed to be from a lack of technical knowledge of the safety controls present in pressurized refueling systems. After investigating the primary incident and other possible refueling scenarios, the following key lessons were discovered. Never tie off or manually hold the automatic fuel nozzle shutoff, as pressurized fuel systems rely on back pressure to switch off the nozzle. Where nozzles are unable to switch off as designed, fuel spillage or tank rupture can occur. Always ensure that the fuel delivery components and the fuel receiving components match, including component manufacturers and settings. Unique mobile plant requirements must also be considered, such as fuel tank size and location of the receiver. Always ensure that any personnel undertaking fast fill refueling activities are aware of the technical specifics of all fuel delivery components, that they understand the hazards and the function of critical safety controls. Whenever it is noticed that the fuel nozzle shuts off prematurely or if fuel is leaking from the overflow hose, always contact maintenance to rectify the issue. Do not utilize any workarounds. The consequences of doing so could result in significant safety incidents and loss of equipment.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, Christian. So one of the immediate things I take away from rewatching that video is that it could have been a hell of a lot worse, with the fact that the fuel on the engine bay had ignited, but the operator was also covered with diesel, and there could have been potential for that incident to be a lot worse. So given that, and knowing that there's quite a fair bit of incidents like this in the past, just involving fires from refueling activities, it was one of the major triggers to create a much larger investigation to this. So next slide, please. So while the video focuses heavily on the operator behaviour in terms of using a manual override or evidence being of a manual override or not knowing how the systems are, there's a better way to be able to control this, is to eliminate the use of pressurized systems to begin with. There are other options for refueling where you can use a fail-safe, non-pressurized fuel system, which I'll go into a bit detail in the next slide. But in order to enforce that, we needed to have an aligned standard to ensure that we're rolling out a step change from pressurized refueling systems to non-pressurized refueling systems in a formal way using this standard. And that standard scope includes making sure that the receiving equipment, all of the heavy earth-moving machinery, has standardized requirements to have those non-pressurized components. The fuel delivery component side of things, in terms of the service trucks and the fixed fuel bays, need to have the same standardized approach for non-pressurized systems and the same litres per minute flow rate, as well as systems inspections and testing. Now, those installations of these new systems are in progress across our fleets, retroactively applied across a lot of our older fleets, and we're following our risk assessment and management of change processes for that one as well. Next slide, please. So to go over this briefly, the big difference between pressurized refueling systems and non-pressurized fail-safe refueling systems is that the pressurized systems are pretty old school, and they do depend on the back pressure of the fuel level in the tank, along with other metrics such as the spring settings in both the nozzle and the receiver. So in this instance, for non-pressurized systems, the way it works is that the receiver shown in the bottom left there actually has a fail shut design, so it's normally closed. What happens when the rotating handle is turned in the on position and fuel flows is that it will go up the pilot line up to the top of the tank and then down into the level sensor within the tank. That sensor will then trigger on while the tank is empty, and a return line will open, which will then allow the receiver to open. And at that point, the fuel will flow into the tank. Now, as that fuel level rises, it should maintain the flow until it gets to that level sensor. And at that point, the level sensor will become disrupted. The return line will then become disrupted, and then the receiver will shut off into that normally closed setting. And that way, no more fuel can be physically delivered into the tank, and we're not relying on the pressure of the tank, which has been known to be a cause for quite a few incidents in the past. So that's a high-level overview of what we intended to go to retroactively, even understanding that quite a few OEMs are already aligning to this. It's just the step change going from older systems to new systems. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can we go down a slide? That's all good. One of the other actions that we that came out of the investigation was really evaluating our risk framework and where this should really tie into it with respect to a risk event of fire and explosion. So listed there, we've got a lot of the existing causes for fire and explosion, but we really had to ask ourselves, and I guess that's something that's a good question to ask attendees here to take back to your companies, is that is there a need to identify the ignition of fuel following overflow during fast refueling activities? Is that something that needs to be added in as a potential cause if pressurized refueling systems are quite prevalent? And in addition, one of the critical controls, would we also need to add a critical control to manage the risk? So do we need to have something around fast fuel system functional integrity, making sure that the components are matched appropriately and maintained against the standard in which we've developed? So those are two key questions we decided to ask ourselves. And next slide. And then finally, in terms of the overall critical control approach, what we had to do with fast refueling systems is making sure that each of the touch points were updated and aligned. So the design standards, as mentioned before, for the fast refueling systems, and standard operating procedures, making sure that they are, correctly identifying the right equipment. In terms of operating standards, we needed to ensure that we had maintenance, safe work instructions and standards in place for the fuel nozzles, for the receivers, for the tanks, and all of the equipment that's involved, making sure that that's all adequately maintained. And then finally, the verification, we can have all these standards in place, but we need to make sure that it is being held to account. So we'd always have embedded into our framework, we'll have infield checks and critical control verifications. And a couple of questions which are really good to ask there if performing these checks in the field is, can the service person complete a fast refuel activity, describe the equipment and how each component operates to protect against these fuel overflow events? And certainly, can they explain the risk associated with restraining the nozzle in the on position, particularly for pressurized refueling systems? And is there any evidence of attached handles and restraints as well? So that's where we'd come to for the critical controls piece. Next slide. And I think that is it. So I might hand back over to Christian. Again, thanks for letting me to run through the presentation. I think it's very valuable to go through the video to show exactly what happened and show these learnings across the industry.
Fantastic, Eric. That's brilliant stuff. Really useful. We do have a few minutes. We've got 10 minutes left, so probably got about 5 minutes or so for any questions or comments. But if you do have any, please use the chat functionality, so we can just again take a log of those items. So we'll give people a few moments to jump in there. I guess while that's happening, Eric, I've got a question or maybe an observation. If I think about in a lot of the risk assessments I've done as a safety professional, there's always an assumption, equipment is fit for purpose. This, I guess, what you're showing and unpacking here is just how, at a real technical level, how potentially we mightn't even know about this. These assumptions potentially are incorrect. I don't know if there was something that sort of fell out in that space as a learning.
Well, the assumption that equipment is fit for purpose is good for a fixed slice of time, but the problem is that when systems develop and update over time, when you've got older equipment, it's not necessarily triggered that it needs to be updated to the new systems. And certainly with this development of non-pressurized systems, and certainly fail-safe non-pressurized systems. One other thing actually that did drop out is that there are available non-pressurized refueling systems on the market. However, when they fail, when the components that deem it non-pressurized fail, they will revert back to a pressurized system instead of closing off the ability to put fuel into it as well. And we thought that was certainly not the way we wanted to go. And we wanted to take that step up from not just not pressurized and non-pressurized, but also the fail-safe non-pressurized, and take that leap. So it is all about making sure that the older equipment falls in line with newer technologies that are safer.
Yeah. Question here from Jody. What was the operator's view as to why they restrained the handle in the on position?
So while it may have been that particular operator's view, from talking to people who perform these activities, the problem stems from having mismatched spring settings, primarily in the fuel nozzle and in the receiver. So if those are mismatched, then the nozzle is going to be overly sensitive for the pressure in the tank. So if it is overly sensitive, what's going to happen is that fuel nozzle is going to shut off prematurely. And that sounds like it's a common practice that happens if those springs are mismatched. The fuel level in the tank may be only a third full or half full, and operators over time understand this, so they have to keep returning it on. And instead of going through that manual process, knowing that that's happening, then they'll just manually tie it on. One of the other things that came out is that people do sometimes think that it's the same as refueling your car at the servo. You know, you just, when it clicks off, I am guilty, I'll always do this, you just give it another couple of squirts to go in. And that's kind of what a mentality has been seen for fast refueling systems. But with these going at 800, 1,000 litres per minute, it's much more dangerous to do so, certainly.
I'll probably put my safety hat on there too. I think it's interesting that you shared how when you had looked at how this task is done across the board, as opposed to, to find out about that, I guess a traditional view, we'd see that as a bypass, or they've tampered with something, and then go down that path. But it sounds like you've done some work to look at how is this task done, not just in the day of the incident, to actually glean out, okay, they're having to use these zip ties because of this issue. So I think that's really well done. And there's a comment here, and you might have just actually answered it, Eric. Comment from Mick. Design of the fill point nozzle. He said you answered it. So well done.
Fantastic. 2 in 1. No, yeah. So, and that's yep. And that allusion actually is in the second video that is going to the Queensland Health and Safety Board, to state that while it is technical in nature, showing the forces, how they interact, we went through a couple of these circumstances that are common misconceptions. And one of those misconceptions is that it is just like a service station filling up. And the other common misconception is that overflow hose is just meant to trickle fuel when it's full and it's done. But that is never meant to be for fuel. It's only for air with fuel particles to go away from that engine bay. So,
yeah, excellent. Okay, I'll move into the wrap-up phase now. I've only got a few minutes left. If anyone has a final question, we might be able to squeeze it in if you throw it on the chat log. So, yeah, calls to action, Eric, because obviously we want to be able to hone in to say, okay, for people that have taken the time to jump on the call, what practically can they do based on this information or the learnings that you're sharing?
Yeah, so with these, it's essentially a lot of the learnings that came out of the video and the presentation, but certainly through this, it'd be a good idea to understand the prevalence of pressurized versus non-pressurized systems at our companies and operations, to check in with service persons if they sort of know the safety features of fast refueling systems, and reviewing the delivery components to make sure they match, because you will get that issue of it's shutting off prematurely or not shutting off in time, which could result in overpressurization as well. So that getting the component settings to match is very important for those pressurized refueling systems, which again can be overridden if we go to a non-pressurized system.
Perfect. And there was a few more there, mate, or have you covered those three off?
Those three are all good. Yep.
Done. Nailed it. Okay. So this, I guess the next steps as a reminder, we've got another webinar coming on the 12th, which is around innovation and technology, and we've actually got a good speaker lined up. Quick question, quick fill versus traditional fill, has an assessment being done, safety, time saving? Assessment being done, safety, time saving.
I'll have to take that one back to the team, actually. I'll spend a bit more time rather than rushing an answer.
Yep.
I'll look into that one.
Not a problem. Okay, so look, Eric, appreciate your time and the work that you've done and taking the time to share this. For me, certainly as a non-technical person, it's quite clear I can understand what happened and what can be done moving forwards to learn from that. So everyone's got the calls to action. The recording will be put on the RIM website. I think everyone's email addresses have been registered, so be able to get a copy of the pack, the BHP pack that Eric went through as well. We'll be able to send that out. And if we tuck the animation over in a certain area, a link to the animation, although I think, well, in addition, I believe that there'll be other distribution mechanisms of that animation as well. I think through other means, very effective. So that in total is everything. So again, Eric, thanks for your time. People who have taken half an hour out of their Friday, thank you for also attending, and I'm sure you've got something out of this. So until next time, thanks very much, and we'll chat to you again in the future. Bye-bye.